Before we begin today's conversation, I invite you to pause for just a moment. Wherever you are, perhaps driving to work, walking through your neighborhood, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, or preparing for the day ahead. Just become aware of God's presence. Take one slow breath, let the noise of the day settle, and open your heart and simply listen. Welcome to the Listening Heart, folks. At its core, leadership integrates how we act and live across business, work, family, and community. And from a spiritual and values-driven perspective, spiritual leadership begins within. It grows from a heart that is attentive to God, rooted in wisdom, shaped by faith, and expressed through everyday acts of love and service. Now, my journey has taken me through several seasons of leadership. I spent 6 years in a seminary under the guidance of Benedictine monks, where I learned that leadership begins long before we are ever given a position of responsibility. And later came years of executive leadership in the public sector, followed by more than 4 decades of consulting and leadership development. And today, I continue that journey as a digital entrepreneur, discovering that learning never ends and that each new season begins fresh opportunities to grow. Hi, I'm Richard Fontanie, and I'll be your host today. And if you're joining us for the first time, a warm welcome. And if you're returning, thank you for coming back. Now, before we begin, if you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And thank you for doing so. Each week, we explore one theme through 3 lenses. On Wednesdays, Coaching Talks examines performance leadership in the traditional workplace. And on Fridays, Digital Marketing Secrets explores adaptive leadership in today's rapidly changing digital world. But today, here on Monday, the Listening Heart poses a different question. How does the gospel shape the way we live and lead in business, work, family, and community? Now, although today's conversation centers on spiritual leadership, remember that each of us is called to influence others. Leadership isn't reserved for executives, teachers, or business owners. It begins whenever we choose to encourage someone, offer hope, extend compassion, or quietly walk beside someone in need of support. And today's conversation is about mentorship as discipleship, guiding and being guided. And now, if I could summarize today's message in a single sentence, it would go something like this. Jesus didn't simply teach his disciples, he walked with them. And mentorship begins with presence before instruction. I believe that a simple truth has something profound to teach us, not only about faith, but also about how we lead every day. Walking before teaching is when we think of Jesus as a teacher. We often picture him speaking to crowds from a hillside or telling parables by the Sea of Galilee. And those moments are certainly important. But when you read the gospel carefully, another pattern emerges. Jesus spent more time walking with people than he did lecturing them. He shared meals, he traveled dusty roads, he listened to questions, he welcomed interruptions, he noticed people that others ignored. He entered homes, he sat around tables, he laughed, he grieved, he prayed, rested, and journeyed with his disciples. In other words, he shared life before he expected transformation. Now let that sink in for a moment. That observation may seem simple, but I think it changes the way we understand mentoring. Many of us assume mentoring means giving advice. We imagine the mentor as the expert and the learner as the student. Yet, Jesus rarely began with instruction alone. He began with relationship. He invited ordinary people to walk with him, fishermen, a tax collector, men and women from different backgrounds, people with questions, people with doubts, people who often misunderstood him. Yet he patiently remained with them. And that tells me something very encouraging. God isn't looking for perfect people before he or she begins shaping them. He walks with people as they are still becoming. Now, isn't that exactly how many of us have experienced God's presence in our own lives? Looking back, I don't remember every sermon I've heard or every leadership seminar I've attended. But I vividly remember the people who quietly walked with me through important seasons of my life. Some offered wise counsel. Others asked thoughtful questions. A few challenged me when I needed correction, and many simply listened. And only years later did I realize that they had been mentoring me all along. Perhaps the same is true for you. Someone believed in you before you fully believed in yourself. Someone saw possibilities you couldn't see. And someone gave you time. That's how God often works. One of my favorite mentoring stories in Scripture occurs after the resurrection. It's a familiar account of two discouraged disciples walking along the road of Emmaus, as recorded in Luke chapter 24. Notice what Jesus does. He doesn't suddenly appear to deliver a sermon. He joins them on the journey. He listens. He asks questions. What are you doing discussing together as you walk along? Imagine that. He asks a question he already knows the answer to. Why? Because mentoring begins with listening. The disciples pour out their disappointment, confusion, and shattered hopes. They thought Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel, and now everything seemed lost. Jesus allows them to tell their story. Only then does he begin to help them see the larger picture. He patiently opens the scriptures and walks with them until their hearts begin to understand. Later, after he breaks bread with them and then disappears from their sight, they say something remarkable. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on that road and opened the scriptures to us? What an image that is. Their hearts changed while they walked together. Not simply because information was shared, but because someone chose to accompany them. And that is discipleship. That is mentoring. And I believe it remains one of the most needed forms of leadership in our world today. When I reflect on the journey to Emmaus, I remember whether those two disciples ever realized that their greatest lesson began long before Jesus explained the scriptures. It began the moment he chose to walk beside them. He entered their disappointment before correcting their understanding. He listened before instructing, and he stayed with them before revealing himself. Now that pattern speaks powerfully to me because it upends many of our assumptions about leadership. We often think influence begins when we have the right answer. Jesus shows us that influence often begins when we offer the gift of our presence. Now that simple truth has shaped many of the most meaningful mentoring relationships in my life. Looking back over the years, I remember people who took time to encourage me, challenge me, and quietly believe in me. They didn't always offer dramatic advice or deliver life-changing speeches. More often, they gave something far more valuable. They were available, listened, asked thoughtful questions, and they noticed. Their presence communicated, "You matter." Now, isn't that one of the deepest human needs? To know that someone sees us, and values us, and is willing to walk with us for a time? I believe that's exactly what Jesus continues to do for each of us. So, what does this look like in everyday life? It begins much closer to home than we sometimes imagine. In our families, mentoring often happens in ordinary moments. Parents and grandparents teach far more through daily example than through occasional speeches. Children notice how we respond to disappointment, how we treat others, how we handle conflict, and whether our words match our actions. Presence shapes character long before instruction shapes behavior. In the workplace, mentoring is often less about having all the answers and more about creating an environment where people feel safe, where they feel safe for learning. And the best supervisors, managers, and team leaders don't simply evaluate performance. They invest in people. They encourage growth, celebrate progress, and help others discover abilities they may not yet recognize in themselves. During my years of consulting, I discovered that organizations with healthy mentoring cultures often shared one characteristic. Leaders made themselves accessible. Their doors, and perhaps more importantly, their hearts, were open. Conversations weren't interruptions to leadership. They were leadership. The same principle applies to those building businesses from home. Digital entrepreneurship can be surprisingly lonely. It's easy to believe we have to solve every problem ourselves. Yet online communities, mastermind groups, accountability partners, and trusted mentors remind us that growth is rarely a solo journey. Even in a digital world, meaningful relationships remain at the heart of lasting success. Within our communities and churches, opportunities are equally abundant. A volunteer who welcomes a newcomer, an experienced member who patiently guides someone new to a ministry, a neighbor who checks on an elderly friend, or a young person who helps an older adult navigate new technology. Each reflects the spirit of mutual mentoring. Now notice something beautiful about those examples. Not one depends on holding an impressive title. They simply require a willing heart. One of the gifts of growing older is experience, and one of the gifts of being young is curiosity. Healthy mentoring requires both. That's why I appreciate the growing emphasis on reverse mentoring. Younger generations often bring fresh insights into technology, communication, creativity, and cultural change, while older generations offer perspective, resilience, patience, and wisdom gained through experience. The church has always flourished when generations walk together. Paul mentored Timothy. Barnabas encouraged Mark after others had given up on him, and Naomi quietly guided Ruth. Yet each relationship was mutually blessed. Now, I have learned a great deal from younger colleagues over the years, particularly my own daughters. They have challenged my assumptions, introduced me to new ways of working, and reminded me that learning never truly ends. And I hope that, in return, I have offered encouragement, perspective, and the confidence that comes from having walked through many seasons of life. Perhaps that's God's intention all along. Not that one generation replaces another, but that each generation enriches the next. Now, there's a reason this podcast is called The Listening Heart. Listening is one of the purest expressions of love. And when we genuinely listen, we tell others that their story really matters. And Jesus listened. The Benedictine tradition begins with the word listen. Saint Benedict opens the rule with an invitation: "Listen carefully, my son, to the Master's instructions, and attend to them with the ear of your heart." Now that phrase has stayed with me, even though I hadn't realized it while I marched through my own life. The ear of your heart reminds us that listening is much more than hearing words. It means receiving another person with openness and patience and humility and compassion. Imagine what our homes would look like if we listened with the ear of the heart. Imagine what our workplaces, churches, and communities would look like with the ear of listening with the heart. Perhaps mentoring begins there, not with impressive speeches, not with perfect answers, but with our presence. Now, as we finish today's conversation, I'd like to leave you with 4 simple questions. Who has quietly walked beside you during an important season of your life? And have you thanked them? Who might be waiting for someone to simply listen? And what would change if this week you chose presence before instruction? Now take one small step, write a note, invite someone for coffee, call an old friend, encourage a younger colleague, ask an honest question, and listen without rushing to solve the problem. You may discover that God uses that simple act to shape another person's future and your own. Oh, and there's just one more thing: the learning lens. So what's the key insight today? Jesus mentored through presence before instruction. He walked with people, listened to them, and patiently helped them discover truth. And spiritual leadership grows from that same pattern. What seemed to work well? Today's gospel reflection reminds us that mentoring is not reserved for experts. It begins where people intentionally walk beside one another with humility, compassion, and hope. And here's a point to consider. In a world filled with constant communication, are we creating enough space to truly listen before we respond? And ask yourself this question: who is the one person God may be inviting you to accompany this week? Not to fix, but simply to walk beside. Today's key takeaway: the greatest mentors do more than teach. They help others discover that they never walk alone. Now take a moment this week to reflect, pray, and realign with your heart. And if this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who may need encouragement today. And thank you for doing so. Until next time, may God bless you with wisdom for your decisions, peace in your relationships, courage in your leadership, and joy in your daily walk. Next Monday, I invite you to join me as we explored another conversation from the listening heart, leading like Jesus, becoming a shepherd leader. Until then, remember, Jesus didn't simply teach his disciples. He walked with them. And may we do the same today. And bye now.